I'm Shell, a modest office worker at a medium-sized company. I met my husband Kyler through work 2 years ago, and we hit it off right away. We started dating without knowing much about each other, but we had a good time. We made time for dates and gradually got to know each other better. I couldn't deny that I started to see him as a good person. He was kind and gentle, always attentive to my needs and concerns. I felt like I could be happy with him. We didn't take long to feel this way, and he proposed after just 4 months of dating. Thanks to a stable job at a big corporation, the engagement ring he gave me had a sparkling diamond that left me mesmerized. I accepted his proposal, and we quickly found a place to live together and started planning our wedding. I was looking forward to a grand wedding, but Kyler wanted to keep it small. In the end, we had a modest ceremony with just close family and friends. It's been almost 3 years since we started living together. I'm now 26, still working, and we don't have kids yet. I wanted to work a bit more, and Kyler wasn't keen on having kids either. Well, I took it positively, thinking it just meant more time for the two of us. But I was starting to want a child. As we were about to celebrate our 3rd Thanksgiving together, "Hey, Thanksgiving is coming up. What should we do?" I asked Kyler, who was engrossed in his phone. He gave a non-committal, and said nothing more. "I'd like to see your family soon," I continued, a bit annoyed at his lack of response. "I have work," he finally said, looking up from his phone. "But you haven't been back home in ages," I pointed out. I hadn't seen my in-laws since the wedding 2 years ago. Every time a long holiday came up, I'd suggest going home, but Kyler would insist he had work. I even offered to go alone, but he opposed it, saying it would be awkward for me and that his sister didn't like me for some reason. So I couldn't just go to his family's home. He wouldn't even give me their phone number, saying he'd handle it. Well, it wasn't like I wouldn't be able to see her forever, so I decided I'd get her contact info when I saw her someday. "Is Thanksgiving a work day for you? What about Christmas?" At a normal workplace, Thanksgiving and Christmas would be days off, but my husband's workplace doesn't always have holidays. Although Saturdays and Sundays are technically days off for him, we haven't had many dates since getting married due to his entertainment dinners and sudden business trips. "Not sure about Christmas," he replied, going back to his phone. And so I decided to spend Thanksgiving and Christmas at my parents' home. I met up with my friend Diana, who asked me something troubling. "What do you think about men cheating?" Diana wasn't married yet, but it seemed like something was up with her boyfriend. She asked me in a rather displeased manner. "Cheating? What? Did something happen? He's always on his phone. He even brings his phone when he showers. Isn't that weird?" That made me think. Kyler was always on his phone at home too. Even when he'd go take showers, he'd bring it along like a pet. I didn't really care, as it had been the case since we got married. But when I heard Diana's story, I was taken aback. "Is that suspicious?" "Of course. He's got his passcode set too. I would want to see, but I'm hesitant to." I couldn't say anything, as I was in the same situation. In fact, I started to worry that Kyler might be cheating too. I couldn't relax at my parents' home after that, and thought about going home early, but Kyler wouldn't be there anyway. So I stayed at my parents' home, feeling uneasy, and returned home as planned. "Hey Kyler, what are you always doing on your phone?" I asked him as soon as I got home. He was on his phone again, but looked a bit flustered at my question, and put his phone in his pocket. "I get a lot of work-related messages. I'm leading a major project, and I can't afford to be away from my phone." I always thought my husband would never lie to me, but lately, something just didn't feel right. He kept saying he was busy with work, but I couldn't help but question everything he did and said. The faint scent that lingered around him was one red flag. He usually got home late, around 11 p.m., and often said he was entertaining clients or working overtime. Yet every so often I catch a sweet smell coming off his suit, like a woman's perfume. I don't wear perfume myself, so I'm not an expert, but it smelled like something a younger woman would wear. As I took his suit jacket to hang it up, there it was again, a sweet scent. I could confront him right there, but I didn't have any concrete evidence. Afraid of making him dislike me, I suppressed the growing doubts and worries in my mind. But then an opportunity came along. He forgot his phone on the dining table while showering. As I sipped my homemade herbal tea, I glanced at his phone. It'd be easy to look now, but if he found out, he could lose trust in me. I was torn. I wanted to clear my suspicions, but if he really was cheating, I may not recover from the shock. Various thoughts flooded my mind as I looked at that phone. Suddenly, it buzzed with a notification. Startled, I took a peek. It was just a message alert, but the content wasn't displayed. I couldn't see the content because he set it so it doesn't show up. I reached for his phone, making sure he had not come out of the shower yet. I held my breath as I moved my fingers to open the phone, but it was locked. Of course. Everybody locked their phone. I was annoyed, but also relieved as I went to put the phone back. Then it buzzed again, this time an incoming call. The screen read, Gabriella. Who was Gabriella? I didn't recognize the name, but I knew I could still answer it even though it was locked. I naturally slid my finger across the screen and put the phone to my ear.
Hello, Kyler. Is this a good time?
The voice on the other end was a young woman. I got even more nervous. Kyler's in the shower right now.
What? Who is this?
I told her he couldn't talk, and her voice changed. It got lower and colder. I'm his wife.
This is not good.
She hung up after saying just that. What did not good mean? I put the phone back on the table. It was clear. He was cheating, and probably with Gabriella. But I didn't have proof to confront him. I looked at his phone on the table, pondering. What did this mean for me? More importantly, what's the right thing to do? Should I get angry? Should I cry? Should I pretend I don't know? No, pretending is off the table now. I did answer the phone after all. Oh, there it is. Lost in thought, I didn't notice him come out of the shower. I caught my husband reaching for his phone and looked at him. Was he checking something or typing a message? It was hard to say. Gabriella called. When he heard this, he stopped what he was doing and looked at me. Oh, did she? The moment our eyes met, he averted his gaze and started fiddling with his phone again. Normally, he'd sit next to me after a shower to have a beer, but not this time. He seemed like he was about to leave. Wait, can we talk for a second? I stopped in with a smile and gestured for him to sit. What about? He stayed put, but didn't come closer. Who's Gabriella? A co-worker? I bet she's cute. She sounds like it from her voice. Hearing this, he turned his surprised eyes toward me. How would you know? I answered the phone. What? As I continued speaking cheerfully, his face transitioned from surprise to what looked like anger. He stopped towards me and pulled my hand. What's the big idea answering my call like that? I had never heard my husband raise his voice like that before. Though taken aback by his sudden change, I knew I couldn't back down. I stood up, looked him in the eye, and asked, What's your relationship with this Gabriella person? We'd never had a fight since we met. Maybe that's why he looked surprised for a moment. She's just a co-worker. His voice softened, and he sat down on a nearby chair. I sat back down too. I couldn't press him further at this point. I'd have to gather evidence later. Just then, his phone rang again. Another call? I asked, noticing his troubled expression as he looked at the screen. He nodded and started to get up, but I grabbed his hand. Answer it on speaker here. If it's work-related, you can turn off the speaker. I suspected it was Gabriella again. I instructed him to let me hear the voice and content. He sat back down and reluctantly answered the call.
Kyler, what was that message about?
The voice from the speaker was his mother's, so it was his mom. I felt a bit relieved, but he didn't respond, his face turning pale. I nudged him to continue the conversation, but he remained silent.
Are you listening? What's this about Rochelle being dead? Tell us where to go. Your father and I are coming to see you right now.
His mother raised her voice, frustrated by his silence. I was shocked. What's going on? I'm right here. I looked at my husband, who was trembling, gripping his phone. I'm alive. A moment of silence followed.
What? Rochelle, what's going on?
His mother sounded just as confused. I was equally puzzled. Why did she think I was dead? What's going on?
Kyler texted me saying you passed away and that he'd handle the funeral alone and that I didn't need to show up.
This made no sense. Was it a spam text or something? I briefly thought. But Kyler's trembling suggested he actually did contact his mother.
I'm coming over tomorrow.
His mother, still confused but seeing no other way to proceed, hung up. I asked my husband for an explanation, but he said nothing. Fortunately, it was still Thanksgiving break, so I was going to be home. I didn't know he was working, but I told him to take a sick day if he had to, and I went to our bedroom. He didn't come to the room that night, and it seemed like he slept on the couch. The next morning, I woke him up, made breakfast as usual, and we waited for his mother. He didn't say a word and looked scared the whole time. He didn't touch his phone either. I didn't bring up his behavior and quietly waited. Around noon, his mother arrived. Kyler's father was with her, carrying lots of bags. I greeted my in-laws warmly, and they reciprocated with smiles, handing me the bags and explaining they were gifts. There were homemade treats from his mother, famous sweets from a local shop, and lots of cakes. We chatted about trivial things for a while, but Kyler didn't join in, shrinking in a corner. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I made tea for my in-laws, pulled my husband by his shirt to sit next to me, and sat down.
What's going on, Kyler?
My father-in-law finally broke the awkward silence, looking exasperated at my husband and I. My husband flinched at his voice, lifting his downcast face to look at him. But he quickly looked down again, as if terrified by his father's expression.
Spit it out.
My father-in-law raised his voice, and my husband started to explain in a shaky voice. Based on my husband's account, he met Gabriella through work shortly after we got married. Initially, they were just colleagues, but things changed when they started working closely on a project. Gabriella confessed her feelings for him. He told her he was married, but she was okay with it, so they started dating. They were together for a little over 2 years. He said all this happened shortly after we got married. At first, he thought it was just a fling, but he started to fall for Gabriella. He considered divorcing me to marry her, but realized he'd have to pay a hefty settlement if he admitted to cheating. So he tried to make my in-laws dislike me, thinking I'd initiate the divorce. He even spread rumors about me to my in-laws and his sister. But my in-laws never showed any signs of disliking me, and I didn't seem to be bothered by it. So he thought about cutting ties with me and paying the settlement. So he told his parents that I had passed away. My in-laws and I were dumbfounded by his foolishness.
You're unbelievable.
I'm so sorry, Rochelle, about our poor son. My mother-in-law apologized, holding back tears. I told her to look up, and then she looked at my husband. Kyler was visibly shaking, his face pale. If you're willing to pay the settlement, I'm okay with a divorce, I told him, smiling. At that moment, my father-in-law landed a punch on my husband's head. You idiot! Break up with her right now. You've lost your freedom. Go home. My husband was too stunned to resist. Kyler was frightened by my father-in-law's furious behavior, and it looked like he was about to burst into tears. I couldn't help but laugh a little.
We'll take responsibility for the settlement,
my mother-in-law said, tears streaming down her face. I wrapped my arms around her and smiled at her. Don't worry about it. I reassured her. After hearing all this, staying together seems foolish. I have a job and we don't have kids. I'm sorry I couldn't be a better wife, I said to my mother-in-law after hearing about my husband and immediately losing interest. My in-laws apologized to me over and over again and left the house, dragging my reluctant husband. We divorced shortly after. I claimed a hefty settlement and kept the house. A few days later, I got a call from an unknown number. It was my sister-in-law. Apparently, she had also been misled by Kyler, and that was why she never tried to get to know me. It turned out, both my sister-in-law and I had no hard feelings about each other ever, and she wanted to reach out to me. She wanted to be friends, even though we were no longer sisters by marriage. She said she wanted to meet up. So I agreed to meet with her and ended the call. A few days later, I saw my sister-in-law for the first time since the wedding. We both were happy to catch up. We quickly became comfortable with each other after chatting and hanging out. From that day on, we stayed in touch and became good friends. She even filled me in on my ex-husband's situation. Apparently, Gabriella had no intention of marrying him. She was just using him for financial support. When I found out, she started making plans to cut ties with him. And apparently she dumped him pretty quickly. He had to quit his job when he moved back in with his parents. And now Kyler's doing manual labor, which he despises, under his father's strict supervision. Hearing all this lifted my spirits. My sister-in-law was probably worried about me, even as she shared this with a smile. I laughed along and told her not to worry, as they planned to keep him under even stricter training. I've learned to be more cautious in choosing a life partner after going through a divorce. I told my sister-in-law that it's all good now, as this experience has led to a positive outcome.
Hey, what's going on? Why are you ignoring this situation? Please, take our daughter to the hospital. When I came home from work, my 1-year-old daughter was crying in an unusual way. Yet, my husband was watching TV, laughing hard at a comedian's joke. Just leave her be. It's not the first time she's thrown a tantrum like this. She'll tire herself out and quiet down eventually. Indeed, my daughter, worn out from crying, started to calm down. But her complexion was poor, and her lips were pale and bloodless. I rushed to call an ambulance. At the hospital, after being examined by the doctor, I was informed of an unbelievable truth. My husband had broken his promise to me and continued to do so in secret without telling me. When my husband, who arrived at the hospital later, was confronted, he turned red with anger and lashed out. "Are you all having fun ganging up on me, making me out to be the bad guy? You told me to watch our daughter, so I did. You never said to comfort her if she cried or to take her to the hospital if something seemed wrong, did you?" My husband, feeling wronged, fled from the hospital. Despite having put our daughter in life-threatening danger without showing any remorse, I resolved to seek revenge. I'm in my late 20s and married. I met my husband through volunteer work in the community. My participation was personal, but my husband was part of a company policy that required him to volunteer on a regular basis. He could interact without bias with anyone, especially being compassionate towards the elderly and young children. I was drawn to him seeing this. Later, we began to see each other on several occasions during volunteer work, which gradually turned into a personal relationship, and my husband made an enthusiastic proposal and we were married. After leaving my hometown for college, I didn't return but instead found a job. Since my life was now centered in the city, we lived closer to the city rather than my hometown after getting married. It was convenient for my husband's commute, and we enjoyed a harmonious newlywed life. Having my in-laws closer than my own parents was a bit of a concern, but I got along with them without any problems. Especially my father-in-law, who continued practicing judo he started when he was young, even now as he approached his 60s. Actually, I also had a phase during my childhood when I was devoted to martial arts, so I had a lot in common with my father-in-law. After getting married, I soon became pregnant. A year and a half into our marriage, I safely gave birth to our daughter, and our happy days increased with the new addition to our family. During my first childbirth, not only did my in-laws and my parents come to support me, But my husband was there too, making me feel cherished by everyone. And I thought our daughter was lucky to have so many people looking forward to her birth. I wondered if I would ever tell her about this time when she's grown up. But the happiness didn't last long. It came to light that the amount of savings and the annual income my husband had shown me before we got married were falsely declared. Regarding the savings, I thought we could overlook the bragging and the lies since we could increase it together from now on. However, I really wished he had been honest about his income. Before I took maternity and parental leave, we were both working, so I hadn't been very aware of his low earnings. But when I am on leave from work to raise our child, my portion of the income is reduced, and it is slowly starting to affect our lives. It would have been okay if it were just the two of us. But with a family member added, it became clear that we couldn't make it on my husband's low income. Kids get more expensive as they grow. Thinking about the future, I couldn't stay relaxed and return to work as soon as our daughter turned 1. I would have liked to return to work sooner. But it took me half a year to find someone to take care of my daughter. Spending my days feeling guilty for leaving my daughter in daycare to work was something I couldn't get used to. Because I didn't want my daughter to feel the same loneliness I did, I had hoped to be a stay-at-home mom until she reached middle school if possible. My mother was a working mom, and from a young age, I was always left at my grandparents' house or in daycare during the day. I felt lonely, but I never resented my mother. She would always make time to see me after coming home from work, no matter how tired she was, and would spend time with me. My father was the same. I felt very loved by my parents. I told myself that if my mother could do it, so could I. No matter how tired I was or how late I returned from work, I always made spending time with my daughter my top priority and showered her with love. My husband seemed to have a job with flexible hours, with no overtime or weekend work, which gave him a lot of free time. When I went back to work, he increased his hours of working from home. The responsibility for taking our daughter to and from daycare fell more on my husband, but he never complained and took an active role in parenting. Realizing once again that my husband loves working for others made me glad I married him. He even volunteers on some weekends. As our daughter grows a bit more, I find myself wanting to resume my community volunteer work. Then, one day, as I came home from work and was changing our daughter's clothes, I noticed a bump on her head. It wasn't there when I changed her this morning, so something must have happened while I was away. When I asked my husband, he said she had bumped her head on the corner of a table leg. Given the size of the bump, she must have cried a lot from the pain. Plus, since head injuries can be tricky and not always apparent from the outside, I naturally thought he had taken her to the hospital. To the hospital for just bumping her head a bit? That's an overreaction, my husband said with a laugh. I lost my cool and snapped back at him. Even adults are told to get checked out after hitting their heads, so why would my husband, with no medical expertise, decide on his own? Then, my husband got defensive, saying why should he be complained at when he was looking after her while working from home. If you're gonna say that, then don't stay late at work and come home for our daughter. Or rather, as her mother, shouldn't there be things more important than earning money? I was furious but held back. Saying more would only escalate the fight. After all, if my husband earned more, this wouldn't be an issue. If there's no overtime, he could work a part-time job in the evenings or even switch to a company that pays better. Parenting is just beginning. With a long road ahead, is this really okay? I've become increasingly anxious about my husband's laid-back attitude. Since this incident, I've started to avoid leaving our daughter with my husband and have taken on her care as much as possible. My company showed understanding towards married women. They even turned a blind eye when I needed to step out temporarily from work. But I couldn't say I can't work overtime too many times. While juggling daycare schedules, I made an effort to perfectly balance work and parenting. During such a life, after about 2 months, there was a funeral in relation to work that I absolutely must attend. An important client who had been very helpful to us had passed away, and I needed to show my face. It was so sudden that I couldn't arrange for weekend childcare, so I reluctantly left my daughter with my husband. After the previous incident where my daughter bumped her head, we went to the hospital together the next day to get her checked. Although it turned out not to be as serious as I feared, the doctor warned us sternly not to take our eyes off her as it might not end so lightly every time. Given that, it seemed my husband had reflected quite a bit. When I asked if I could trust him this time, he assured me there wouldn't be a repeat of the same mistake. I decided to trust his words and left it in his hands. Still, I couldn't shake my worries and called my husband soon after I left home. I checked in again before entering the funeral home, worrying that too many calls might make him snap at me, but I couldn't help it. However, this time, my husband didn't react poorly to my persistent checking and kindly reassured me, calling me a worrywart. I told myself that as a father, he must be growing too, and it would be fine, before I entered the funeral home. After attending the funeral until the end, I was still concerned about my daughter, so I decided to head straight home. A coworker who is also a housewife offered me a ride, which I gratefully accepted, because it would get me home faster. After being dropped off in front of my house and watching the car drive away, I entered my home. Then, I heard my daughter's crying coming from the living room. Rushing there, I found her lying on her back, crying loudly. But my husband, instead of comforting her, was absorbed in the TV, occasionally letting out laughs. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled, turning off the TV he was watching. Annoyed, he snapped back that I was ruining the good part and snatched the remote from my hand to continue watching. As if he was protesting me yelling at him, he turned up the TV volume even louder. Then, my daughter's crying gradually became quieter. I immediately realized it wasn't just because of the TV's volume. Her complexion was getting worse, and she seemed to have trouble breathing. "Please, get the car ready now." I could drive, but being a novice driver, I didn't have much confidence. After all, we hadn't sold the car, despite my husband's salary not being enough for a family of 3, thinking it would be handy in case something happened to our daughter. "It's not like she hit her head today, it's just fussiness, right? Just leave her be. Look at her face and tell me to leave her. Just take us to the hospital, that's all. All right, after this show ends, I'll go." My daughter's lips had lost all color. I felt her breathing become more labored. Deciding I couldn't wait for my husband to act, I called for an ambulance. I grabbed only what was necessary and rode in the ambulance when it arrived. I requested the pediatric clinic that took care of my daughter. But due to it being late on a holiday and not equipped for emergencies, we had to look for another hospital. The ambulance wouldn't leave until a destination was confirmed. After being turned away by a couple of hospitals, we finally found a general hospital in the next town willing to take us. During this time, my husband was still engrossed in the TV, showing no interest in us. I told him I would call him once we reached the hospital, and left with my daughter alone. Upon arrival, the on-duty doctor examined and treated her. I had a prejudice against on-call doctors, akin to part-time physicians, and honestly, I was worried. But the doctor conducted a thorough examination and quick treatment. The doctor prefaced by saying it could have been quite dangerous if we were any later, but after the treatment, reassured us, "She's safe now." I felt a sudden relief and nearly collapsed. A nurse approached me, saying the doctor would explain the situation. My daughter would stay in the hospital overnight for observation. The doctor started with the conclusion. It turned out that her daughter had accidentally ingested an e-cigarette. Even a small amount was too much for her 1-year-old body, leading to a sudden change in her condition. When asked if anyone in the household smoked, I reflexively shook my head no. This was because my husband had promised to quit smoking when he found out I was pregnant. Since then, I had never seen him smoking. Nor had I detected the distinctive smell of tobacco, so I had always believed he had kept up with quitting. But it turned out to be different. He had been smoking in secret, careful not to get caught. Though I initially shook my head no, I corrected myself, acknowledging the possibility that my husband might have smoked without my knowledge. Then, my husband arrived at the hospital, looking lethargic. The moment I saw him, I couldn't hold back from confronting him. "Why have you been sneaking around smoking? If you're going to hide and smoke, at least don't do it around our daughter." "What? What's with the sudden outburst? It's fine now, isn't it? The pregnancy is over." "That's not the point." My husband further trivialized our daughter's condition with an indifferent remark, suggesting everything was fine since she was safe. That's when the previously silent doctor raised his voice. "I'm not here to interrogate you on why you smoked in secret from your wife. However, children are curious and tend to put everything in their mouths. It's common sense for a father to keep anything that might be ingested out of reach." He also sternly reprimanded my husband for not imagining the harm, even a small amount, could do to a 1-year-old, in an era when the dangers of tobacco are well known to adults. "Why am I being blamed like this? This is ridiculous." Embarrassed or perhaps wounded in his pride by the doctor's scolding, my husband's face turned red. And he sulked away, eventually fleeing the scene. Honestly, his absence posed no problem. Moreover, without him around, perhaps my daughter could sleep more peacefully, considering he hadn't been there to help when she was suffering. Right now, I felt that my priority shouldn't be chasing after my fleeing husband, but to stay by the side of my daughter, who had endured so much pain in her small body. The next day, when the pediatrician examined her, we decided on a bit more observation and an extended hospital stay. While the on-call doctor had deemed her ready for discharge, considering I worked during the day, it made sense to keep her under full-time hospital care for now. I went home for a bit to prepare for my daughter's hospital stay and found it difficult to go to work, so I called in sick. When I got home, there was no sign that my husband had returned since he left. Had he just sulked and come back home, maybe there would have been room for a redo. But he pretended not to see it, not even feeling bad about what he did to his daughter, and when it was pointed out to him, he got upset and ran away from home. His actions were on par with those of a middle schooler. I was appalled. My daughter's recovery is the priority now, but once that's over, I've strongly considered divorcing my husband. However, 3 days passed, and my husband hadn't returned. I had no clue where he might be, despite looking everywhere I could think of. By the 5th day, I couldn't stand it anymore and contacted my in-laws, telling them everything that had happened. After hearing from me, my in-laws found out that my husband was at least showing up for work and ambushed him at his workplace. In fact, I had called his company the day he didn't come home. But they said he hadn't come in. Whether he instructed them to say that to my calls or he truly hadn't shown up, I didn't know, but I was relieved to hear he was at least safe. He might be a failure as an adult, a husband, and a father, but the thought of him dying out there would be too much for me to bear. Even if his actions were problematic, splitting up in anger isn't something I'd feel good about. And disappearing without even apologizing for his treatment of our daughter felt cowardly. However, he couldn't escape my mother-in-law, who had a background as a track and field athlete in her student days. And then he was firmly pinned down by my father-in-law. My husband resisted desperately, but he was no match for my father-in-law. When my in-laws brought him back, my husband's suit was tattered. They had also been fully informed about how he treated our daughter and had given him a thorough dressing down. My husband was completely demoralized and deflated by the time they caught him. After fleeing from the hospital that day, he had never gone home but instead went straight to a hotel. He apparently got new clothes there. Where he got the money for that, I wanted to question, but more pressing was his behavior towards our daughter. "Weren't you worried about our daughter? Even if you didn't want to face me, couldn't you have checked with the hospital during my absence and come to visit her? An amateur like me wouldn't make a difference, right? Illnesses and injuries should just be left to the doctors. It's not about that. Didn't you feel worried as a person, as a father? I understand that not everyone develops maternal or paternal instincts upon becoming a parent. But to not even worry as a human being, what does that mean? Was your enthusiasm for volunteer work just for show? I'm more disappointed by your lack of human emotion than your absence of fatherly instincts. I'm sorry, but I don't think I can do this anymore." Let's get a divorce. Divorce? Isn't that an overreaction for such a small thing? Besides, it was our daughter who put it in her mouth because you didn't discipline her properly. I wish I could spend more time teaching and raising our daughter slowly. Moreover, it's far easier for an adult to be cautious than to discipline a young child. I wanted to blame it on my husband not being more responsible or his poor earnings. But saying that felt wrong. As I struggled with how to persuade him, my father-in-law, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. Enough is enough. The real issue is your lack of patience. Apparently, my husband once worked for a company that paid better but couldn't handle the intense workload and resigned to join his current company. The conditions were no overtime, no business trips, no transfers, and no work on holidays. He chose this company wanting to make meaningful use of his personal time, even though it meant his salary wouldn't increase. When we got married, my in-laws were surprised I decided to marry him despite his income. Today, it's outdated to expect the husband to be the sole breadwinner. It's not bad for the one who can earn to do so and the other to take care of home responsibilities. It seems they thought we had married with that understanding. You get into trouble because you pretend to be more than you are. Marriage means taking on your partner's life as well. You don't have the right to have a family if you're not prepared for that. My husband was sternly reprimanded by my father-in-law and couldn't talk back, overwhelmed by his forcefulness. He was told he needed a serious attitude adjustment and that if he wanted to continue the marriage, he should attend the dojo daily. It seems my husband was traumatized by the strict training he received at his father-in-law's dojo during his childhood, to the point that just seeing a judo uniform would cause him to hyperventilate. Preferring divorce over reliving that nightmare, he muttered about getting a divorce under my father-in-law's pressure, and we were able to smoothly proceed with it. Sometime after the divorce, my husband contacted me. During the divorce, we agreed that instead of a lump sum, he would pay child support monthly until our daughter turns 20. My in-laws have been strictly monitoring the payments, and so far, there have been no delays. But when my husband contacted me, hinting that the payments might become difficult, I thought it was about the child support and answered the phone. Actually, my colleague saw me being pinned down with a grappling technique by my dad. It turned out to be quite the spectacle, becoming a hot topic at my husband's workplace. Feeling humiliated by my father-in-law, he confided to his colleague that it was just a minor incident that everyone blew out of proportion regarding what he did to our daughter. He even said, "I was just looking after my daughter because my wife asked me to, and then I got scolded, which was really inconvenient for me." Indeed, I had asked him to make sure our daughter didn't fall or bump into anything, to watch her carefully. That doesn't mean just to look after her in a passive sense, but my husband explained it as if he was just watching because I had asked him to. However, that backfired. His colleague ended up saying, "Man, you're lame. That's like saying you were told to watch a bag but didn't chase the thief because you weren't specifically told to retrieve it if stolen. You're just being contrarian. What are you, a kid?" And that was the end of it. Moreover, since my husband spoke about it loudly in the cafeteria, all the surrounding employees heard it. He ended up being criticized by the employees who listened in as being unreasonable. After hearing the rumors, his boss called him in for a lecture about what he learned from his volunteer work, leaving him feeling uncomfortable at work as if being looked at with disdain. He mentioned that work was becoming difficult and he might not be able to pay child support if this continues. He tearfully begged me to explain to everyone that it wasn't his fault and that it was just everyone else making a big deal out of it. My husband hadn't shown any remorse. He agreed to the divorce and to pay child support just because he didn't want to be scolded by my father-in-law. Maybe he saw marrying me as an easy way out, just a good mark. Our marital life was mostly supported by me anyway. "You've never apologized to me or our daughter, have you?" "I don't recall being thanked either." "Why should I listen to your request? I agreed to the divorce and the child support, didn't I? What more do you want from me? Come on, it's your turn to do something for me. After all, I got a lot of flack from your dad because of you." Listening to my husband's reasoning only gave me a headache. I told him not to call me about anything other than child support ever again and hung up. But he called back persistently, begging me to help. I was so annoyed that I told him my father-in-law was currently visiting, and with that, the persistent calls stopped. Later, I heard from my in-laws that my husband felt so out of place at his job that he resigned on his own. My husband, lacking technical skills, managed to find a new job but only at a company with even lower wages. He sought financial help from my in-laws, but my father-in-law firmly rejected him. He was suggested by my mother-in-law to live at home to save on rent, but he refused, saying he couldn't stand living with my father-in-law and is somehow managing on his low income. However, things became tough, and he reached out to me. He wanted to reduce the child support amount, claiming it was a significant burden. "You have nothing else to offer our daughter but money, so at least do that much. If you really want a reduction, let's go through lawyers. But know that I won't agree to a decrease even if it goes to court." I also warned him that if payments were delayed, I'd sue to recover the funds, and he decided it was better to keep paying the agreed amount on time than to cover lawyer fees. I moved back to my parents' house and am balancing parenting and work with their help. My dad got rehired for 3 days a week at the company he worked at until retirement, saying he's still capable of working. My mom retired early for my daughter. I felt bad for my mother, who loved her job, but she wanted to do for my daughter what she could not do for me. "Don't worry, it's just my self-satisfaction," she said, always by my daughter's side to ensure she never feels lonely. Coming home to someone waiting feels comforting. Seeing the lights on at home brings me peace. The family I always longed for is now right in front of me. Returning home has allowed me to focus more on work than ever. Though the commute to the office increased, I was eventually transferred to a branch closer to my parents' home. I'm still in touch with my in-laws. We talk directly or share videos of my daughter's growth remotely, watching over her together. Our shared hope is just one thing: for our daughter to grow up healthy and happy.